are talking with a junior developer who wants to do a good job and can write good code and things like this. But now, this would be a plus, writing proper documentation. What advice could we give someone like that?
So what I wish I'd known 20 years ago. I think there are two things, but they're kind of the same thing. The first thing is about the fact that it's a problem we all have in specialist jobs and specialist roles. Programmers are not immune. We sort of assume that everybody else's job is not that hard and kind of easy and that there's no real expertise. And as, for example, a programmer, it can be a shock to discover that, for example, the designers or the chef in the canteen or whoever in the organization has studied things and has technique and has abstraction and can explain what they do, and they have process and all of the things that we do. We thought they just did the thing and they just made it look easy, and we assumed it was easy because they made it look easy. But learning to make something look easy is generally quite hard, whatever it is. So this applies to writing too. So the first big realization that took me a very long time is to realize that the difference between good writing and bad writing is that kind of thing. It's not either some kind of natural innate talent that some people are born with. It's a learned skill, but it is a real thing. Okay, and the ultimate result here is that the person who's better at it maybe worked to get there, and there are people who only do this, called technical writers, who can be amazing at it at a whole level that you don't know about until the first time you work with a technical writer. Can be kind of a surprise that somebody can be so good at this thing that you just hated and you didn't realize why. Well, you hated it because you were just not very good at it. So that's the first advice is that it is a specific thing that some people get good at, and it's not just that documentation itself is some kind of problem. It's just one of the many things that are hard, and it's helpful to be good at. And that not everybody has to be good at it. Not everybody on the team has to have all of the skills. So, if you don't know if you don't have somebody on the team who's going to be the writer, then maybe you should hire a technical writer. So thinking about that leads into the second thing, which is as follows. It's very, very hard to be the best programmer in town. I mean, trying to be the best programmer in town is definitely a good idea. But at a certain point, it's gonna be quite crushing especially if you realize that you're not. One of the things that I've most enjoyed doing in my career, that I've done many times, and writing is only one of them, is doing coding plus something else. Can be very interesting, can be very high leverage. If you're a pretty decent coder and you don't suck at a second thing, that can be useful. If you're competent at the second thing, that can be a game changer. And if you're pretty decent at the other thing, then you can be the only person in town who's pretty decent at these two things. Writing is one of the things that could be that second thing. So, in my ideal team of people to work with, everybody has chosen a different second thing. Everybody has a different thing. That diversity of skills is what makes a cross-functional team interesting and powerful. So I'm not saying it has to be writing. These tend to be very tedious threads on Twitter where somebody argues that their second thing is the one true thing that all coders should do. As well as coding, you should be an expert in writing compilers and algorithms and computer science. Or as well as coder, you should be an expert in foreign languages or testing or documentation, or there isn't literally an endless list. The most useful thing you can be is the one that nobody else is, whatever that thing is. Writing is one of the candidates, and it's probably not hard on a software team to be a better writer than anybody else on the team. And if you become that person, then doors open. So make it a deliberate choice, and respect the choice of other people and respect the skill, and experiment. And also, if you decide that your number two thing is something else, it's worth trying not to be completely useless at all of the others. The idea of the T-shaped profile, the generalizing specialist. This goes by lots of names. And so it may be including writing in that, because writing is something that's going to happen on your software development team.
Yeah, so one thing that I noticed that was interesting to me is I love to write, and I've been writing for I was computing at some point that I was writing for probably 35 years or so, because I started writing some sci-fi when I was very young, and stories and all kind of stuff. And I think one of my hypotheses, but for which I don't have a lot of proof, is that by writing things, this helps you writing better code. There seems to me there's some kind of connection in the brain between these two things, between the ability of forming a sentence that is informative, that transmits proper grammar and structure, a certain idea, to writing code that is understandable by other people. Do you have a similar experience, or?
Yeah, and I'm not the only one. I discovered when I was sort of researching, doing a presentation about naming things, and I was looking for advice about naming things because I didn't want to have to invent it all, and there was basically none. Right, which on the one hand meant I had to do some work to prepare the presentation, but it did mean that probably nobody else had done it. And then I came across the idea of sort of looking at recommendations for advice to writers. Maybe some of that, indeed, would there be some kind of crossover? So that was my question, would there be this kind of crossover? And I discovered there was in a slightly different way. Well, not only is there advice to writers, but there's lots and lots of it. There's literally a website called Advice to Writers. It seems that when writers are kind of want to avoid what they should be working on, instead of building content management systems, they write about writing, and they're writers, so more of it. So the same kind of thing, I guess. And if you look at what famous writers have written in their advice about writing, and you imagine that it was a coder giving you the same advice, and you read it word for word, pretending that they were talking about code, a lot of it makes a lot of sense and sounds like a really good idea. And so I use this as a slide in one of the presentations. There's a 1946 essay by George Orwell writing about the English language, politics in the English language is the name of the essay. And in the end, he kind of ends up with these rules for kind of clear writing. And it doesn't require much effort to translate them to coding. And this is not weird because, we write code. It is it's a very different kind of language, a very different kind of purpose, but it's not an entirely different thing. It's not like interpretive dance where you have to struggle a bit harder to make the connection. And also, if you look at the things that we struggle with in coding, not all of them are things that a compiler cares about. Mm-hmm. And again, naming is the most obvious example. The compiler does not care about the naming. And I read this description of writing from one of the great authors of literature. I'm not sure. I guess maybe it was Hemingway or something. I went through a phase years ago of kind of catching up on what I didn't read at school. And the advice was roughly that about writing, that you don't just write the text. You write the text and then you agonize over every single word, and you ask 20 questions about every single word, and is this the right word? And you endlessly edit it and change it and try and make it just right. Code is a lot like that. We don't just type continuously all day. The idea that you work all day and you wrote 10 lines of code is because you've endlessly edited, you've endlessly agonized over the little details, but also the larger abstractions, and try to make it all fit together. Writing novels is like that too. People who don't write novels maybe don't realize that. It's not like that for all novelists, apparently. Some really do just kind of bang away at the typewriter continuously. But a lot of what they're saying, struggling to find the right word for the concept you have in your mind. That phrase is, about writing. It was written about writing, but it could just as easily be about object-oriented programming. Which is what class do I need to have in order to express this abstraction? So in that sense, there is a fairly obvious overlap, I think. Mm-hmm. And so then I'm not surprised that there's this sort of quite direct kind of benefit from exploring both at the same time.